This week, we begin the 14th week of the semester. We have just 1 week of lecture left and then finals week. We do not have a final exam in this class. Instead, I give you the entire week to be able to work on your final project. Hopefully, you've been working on it up until this point, but if you haven't, you'll have the extra finals week in this class to work on that assignment. This week, we're going to learn about some of the subfields of psychology that many of you are more familiar with. Many of these areas of expertise emerged in the mid-1900s. This lecture is divided into 5 parts. We will begin with cognitive psychology, then we will learn about neuroscience, perceptual psychology, social psychology, and we will finish with personality psychology. Let's start with cognitive psychology, take a look at Jean Piaget and some of the other early cognitive psychologists. We have spent the entire semester learning about psychology in the 1800s, in the early 1900s. Now we're going to look at how psychology developed in the mid-1900s. From cognitive psychology, we get neuropsychology, perceptual psychology, then social and personality psychology. Cognitive psychology came first, and if you remember, cognitive psychology is related to Gestalt psychology, which was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. At this point in the semester, you probably recognize how important it is to consider the zeitgeist, the climate of the times, in order to truly understand any historical event. So what was going on in the middle of the 1900s that contributed to the rise of these 5 subfields? This was a time of great social change, of rebellion, of challenging the institutions, of fighting for justice for one's group. In this photo, there are 2 major social events depicted: the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Some Americans protested racial and gender discrimination. Other people protested the Vietnam War. Some people protested both. Because the general public was concerned about these issues, psychologists became concerned about these issues. All 5 of these fields contributed to our study of these very important social issues in the 1950s and 1960s. Not only were psychologists studying topics of interest, but the general public was looking for more options, looking for change, looking for something different, looking for other answers that maybe they had never heard before. Psychologists in these 5 fields helped feed people's curiosity about themselves, about their friends, their family, their groups, other people in other cultures. It was during this time that these 5 fields were met with open arms. If it had been earlier in the century, these 5 fields would have had to compete with behaviorism, which was very popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They would have had to compete with functionalism, psychoanalysis, humanistic psychology in the 1950s. One of the other things that contributed to the development of cognitive psychology was that in the mid-1900s, some psychologists were concerned that behaviorism, operant conditioning principles, could not fully explain all human behavior. Language was one of the issues that many of them brought up. We do not learn language solely through rewards and punishment. There are other processes at play, and behaviorism just couldn't fully explain those processes. In response, several individuals began to study language and other forms of human development. People like Piaget, Bartlett, Broadbent, Miller. These individuals helped bring about cognitive psychology, but it didn't get its official name until 1967 when Ulrich Neisser published his book and officially gave it that name. All of this was happening during a time when the federal government was trying to compete with the Soviet Union. So the government was willing to invest more money into scientific research. Cognitive psychologists took advantage of this, applied for grants. That grant money helped fund their research, which helped expand this subfield of psychology. The momentum that the field experienced in the mid-1900s continued into the late 1900s, in part because neuropsychologists came up with all kinds of new ways of measuring brain activity. I've been talking about cognitive psychology for a few minutes now. Let's take a look at a definition. It is the scientific study of mental processes and mental operations, the study of how our mind works. Cognitive psychologists do not focus on emotions. They do not focus on behavior. It doesn't mean they don't study them or they don't measure them. It just means these two areas are not the focus of their attention. They are concerned with the C of the ABCs, A being affect, emotions, B, behavior, C, cognition. Perception, intelligence, creativity, decision-making. You can study some of these topics from a different perspective, but these topics you will often find in the cognitive psychology journals, in the cognitive psychology textbooks. If you've taken cognitive psychology here, you know that these are some of the chapters in your book. Cognitive psychologists might ask questions like, how reliable is our memory? How does implicit bias impact our decisions? How do we create new ideas? How do we create new ideas in groups? All of these questions and many, many more would be of concern to a cognitive psychologist. Cognitive psychologists were not the only ones who were interested in cognition in the mid-1900s. Cognitive science is the name of the broader field that developed at the same time cognitive psychology developed. This is another one of the factors that allowed this subfield to develop at the time that it did. Cognitive psychologists were not the only ones who were interested in cognition. There were others, anthropologists, educators. Many people were interested in how do people think and how does that thinking, how does cognition impact how they relate to other people, how they learn, how they make decisions, how creative they are. How can we replicate that with artificial intelligence? Jean Piaget was one of the earliest contributors to cognitive psychology. He's also one of the more famous psychologists. I'm sure many of you recognize his name. He was born in Switzerland and trained at the University of Neuchâtel. He earned his PhD in biology in 1918. He contributed an enormous amount of information in terms of human development to the field. He was very popular, very well liked. He spent most of his career studying human development in children and in adults. Now, his work was not popular in the United States until the 1960s. He was wildly popular in Europe, but it wasn't until many decades after he published his work, the work that we are all familiar with, it wasn't until several decades after that work had been published that he became popular in the United States. Two reasons for this. One, his publications had not yet been translated into English. And number two, in the 1930s, American psychologists were obsessed with behaviorism, which didn't leave a lot of room at that time for other ideas to gain any traction. By the end of the 20th century, he was the second most cited psychologist of the 1900s, just one spot behind B.F. Skinner. That just goes to show how popular he was, how much he contributed. I don't give him enough credit in this class, I will admit. The year after Piaget earned his PhD, he met Theodore Simon, who introduced him to Alfred Binet. For several years, Piaget worked for Binet at one of his institutions where they tested the verbal intelligence of school-aged children. He interviewed large numbers of children and then compared their answers to adults' answers to the same questions. He concluded, as we all know, that children and adults think very differently. Their cognition is different, both qualitatively and quantitatively. He was also one of the first individuals to suggest that children, people, are active learners, that people actively seek out new knowledge and try to learn. The brain does that automatically. Up until this point, many people suggested that learning just happens. It's sort of this passive process. Remember when we talked about latent learning? Sometimes learning can be passive, absolutely. But Piaget believed children are more active in that process. They make decisions, they have preferences, what they pay attention to, what they perceive, all of that makes a difference in terms of how they develop into adults. After fine-tuning his ideas, he published them in 1936. He created a 4-stage theory of cognitive development to try to explain how children's cognition in childhood develops into the cognition we typically see with adults. How does that change happen? Here are Piaget's 4 stages. His first stage is the sensory motor stage and lasts from birth until about 2 years of age. During this time, babies rely on physical action and reflexes to learn about their environment. They pick things up, they smell them, they stare at them, they put them in their mouths and drool all over them. They use their hands, their feet, and their senses to learn about their world. In the next stage, which lasts from about 2 to 7 years of age, the pre-operational stage, children begin to represent their world with symbols, objects, names, words, descriptions. In the third stage, the concrete operational stage, which lasts from 7 to 11 or 12 years of age. During this stage, children can think more logically about concrete objects. They aren't masters of abstract information, which is why we don't ask third graders to study chemistry and physics. Some of them can, but the majority of children that age are just not able to wrap their brains around the abstract ideas of natural science. During the fourth and final stage, which lasts from pre-adolescence all the way into adulthood, during this stage, children learn how to think more abstractly, more logically. Overall, their cognitive ability is much closer to that of an adult than it has ever been before. Sir Frederick Bartlett was an experimental psychologist in England. His work did not become popular in the United States until the 1960s, just like with Jean Piaget. Bartlett was focused on memory, cognition. He studied animal learning and pilot fatigue. He was interested in how the mind gets tired and how the mind tries to fight being tired. He suggested we organize information, our experiences, our perceptions. We organize that information into groups, units. He called those units schemata collectively. Each one was referred to as a schema. He said our memory has a schema for nearly everything we come into contact with. We all have a schema for school, for work, for friend, dog, cat, pet, hobby, Netflix, you name it. We all have a way of thinking about each one of those topics. So think about dog schema. The way that you think about dogs is very much based on your life experiences. If you've had positive experiences like I have, you probably love dogs. So when I say the word dog, or when I hear the word dog, I have positive thoughts, positive feelings. If you don't like dogs, when I say dog, or when you hear dog, you probably have negative thoughts, negative experiences. So he recognized that everyone has a slightly different schema for any one topic. The word dog means something slightly different to each one of us. People with different experiences will have different schemata. Here is an example of a schema for English teacher. Now, when I say English teacher, what comes to your mind probably won't match exactly what you see on the screen, and that's okay. People with different experiences will have different schema, will have different schemata. The schema for English teacher that you see here involves everything from that person's training to the different parts of their job to the different tests that they need to be able to pass. It's got salary information. The topic of English teacher might bring something totally different to your mind. You might think about children, you might think about books, writing, essays. It depends on your experiences. So, how did he figure this out? He brought participants into his lab and asked them to read a story, The War of the Ghosts. I have a copy of the original story here. Take a moment to read it and then push play. He had them read the story and then recall as much as they possibly could after reading the story. He did this several times with each participant. He had them come back several weeks apart, recall the information. We call this the method of repeated reproduction. Someone is asked to reproduce a story or something they were asked to memorize, and they're asked to reproduce it repeatedly, several times. The story, The War of the Ghosts, is a Native American folk tale, and his participants were English. As you can imagine, the story was very different from anything that his participants had ever read. It was very new to them. He predicted that some parts of this story would not make sense to his participants. That was done on purpose. He wanted to see how they would reconstruct their memory of the story. Each time he interviewed them, they remembered less and less of the story. They remembered bits and pieces, but their minds, their brains filled in a lot of the blanks with information from, you guessed it, their own cultures, with information that made sense to them, with information from their schemata. For instance, the phrase something black coming out of his mouth became foaming at the mouth. In Native culture, something black coming out of the mouth is a metaphor for death. But English people didn't recognize this, didn't understand this, so they translated it to foaming at the mouth. And he had several participants change that part of the story into foaming at the mouth. If it happens once with one participant, okay, that's probably chance. But if you start to notice a pattern where individuals from one culture are making the same exact mistake, you're onto something. So he realized many of his participants were filling in the blanks that they didn't remember with information from their own lives, information from their own culture. During World War II, Donald Broadbent studied selective attention and discovered that humans have a really difficult time trying to pay attention to two simultaneous messages. If you've got two people talking to you at the same time, which is often the case when you have a young child with you, they want to talk to you at the same time that you're talking to other adults. It's really difficult for any human being to truly listen to both messages. Our brains are designed to handle one message at a time. When we do hear two messages, we tend to filter one of them out, try to ignore it, and select the other one to pay attention to, selective attention. He called it the cocktail party effect. If you've ever been at a party where you're having a conversation with someone and from way across the room, you hear your name mentioned and turn your attention to it, that is the cocktail party effect in full force. Being able to pay attention to a second message and turn your attention to that second message over the first message is a form of selective attention, being able to ignore one and select the other. Then in 1956, George Miller suggested that our memory is limited in the amount of information that it can store. Through a series of cleverly designed experiments, he concluded that the average person can remember 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. That is anywhere between 5 and 9 units. He had participants memorize lists of words and found they were able to remember more words when they chunked some of them together. If you're trying to remember your grocery list, it makes more sense for your brain if you chunk items that are related together. So for instance, instead of trying to remember orange juice and water separately as two different items, you would chunk them together and try to remember that orange juice and water, they're both liquids, you need both of them. That's one chunk instead of two. Now that you have a better understanding of how cognitive psychology developed, let's turn our attention to neuropsychology, a related field.